Welcome everyone to this last lecture of the École des Modalités series for 2025. I'm happy to see all of us gathered here to talk about a very interesting artist and to me. Before introducing our lecturer, Anne Monahan, which I'd like to thank, I would like to have a word about Daniel Soutif, a great art historian, critic, and passeur, as we say in French, and a dear friend who recently passed away. Daniel made a lecture, including in his presentation, Horace Pippin in 2021 in the École des Modernités series. And I thought it was a good occasion to pay a tribute to him and have a thought for him. So here's for you, Daniel. So as I said, tonight's lecture will be given by Anne Monahan, who is an independent scholar and art historian based in New York. Anne's works focuses on 20th century art in the United States with a specific emphasis on African American artists. Among her publications, which includes contributions to art journals, the Burlington Magazine, Metropolitan Museum, I'd like to mention two monographs. The first was entitled Face Ringgold Die for MoMA in 2018, and precisely Horace Pippin, American Modern, published at Yale University Press in 2020. Tonight's talk will precisely come back to this subject, Horace Pippin, American Modern, that's its title, and envision the way Horace Pippin, this American self-taught artist who was famous at his time, was or was not included in the modern art canon. So it's also a reflection not only on his career, on his great art, but also on the writing of the art history. So I would like to thank you again, Anne, for accepting this lecture, and we'll all ears. Well, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Hugo. Bonjour, and thank you for the introduction and the invitation. I've long admired this program, and I'm honored to be part of it. So I'll start by saying that I'm excited to speak about Pippin, who is luckily, this isn't the first time you've heard of him here. As you said, a self-taught painter whose meteoric career, which was just 9 years in the public, qualified him during that time as the most successful Black artist in the United States, maybe the world, because just leave that alone. Between his debut in a local art show in 1937 and his untimely death in 1946, he took part in almost 100 national and international exhibitions, and attracted the support of high-profile collectors and curators and critics, dealers, and as a modern primitive, which was the name under which that group of self-taught artists was being marketed in the 1930s and the 1940s. He was by the time he was into the sort of height of his career, he was recognized as a contemporary artist, full stop. And I'm going to sort of speak about the way in which France and French aesthetics figured in that reputation. This is a relatively unusual approach to him because he's frequently considered, and described as distinctly modern, which is a phrase that Albert Barnes, one of his patrons, used to describe him. So I'm just going to sort of tell that story in a different way in honor of the venue that we're enjoying here. So I should say that his posthumous reputation, unlike his reputation in life, has dovetailed with cyclical interest in self-taught artists and Black artists that tends to cast the former, the self-taught, as aesthetic innocence, and the latter as particularly sensitive to African influence and largely insensitive to any other kind. And I would say that is, I would say the period I'm speaking about is the mid-century self-taught and Black artists, not contemporary self-taught or Black artists. The last decade or so has seen a rise of interest in the U.S., especially in recovering the cosmopolitan climate for interwar autodidacts and Black artists. And you can see that in Lynn Cook's Outlier show at the National Gallery, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art's exhibition on the New Negro movement. And I believe Denise Morel spoke about that with you in the spring. And so this paper continues in that vein. I'm going to, as I said, consider today how France catalyzed and propelled Pippin's career by looking closely at the long shadow cast by his service in World War I and the multiform role of French aesthetics in his reception. If time allows, I'll also consider the unexpected impact of French aesthetics on the posthumous presentation of his work. So we'll see if we get to that. And I'm hopeful that by recognizing the international dimensions of a career of an artist who's often celebrated, as I said, as distinctly American, we can account more fully for his project and model a more expansive history of modernism in the United States. So first, I want to take a moment to give you a bit of background, which I need to do by doing this. Horace Pippin was born in 1888 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour outside of the city of Philadelphia. He was the youngest of Harriet Johnson Irvin Pippin's 7 children, and there's no consistent record of his father. Most of the family had moved to Westchester from Charlestown, West Virginia, which you see here, where his mother, Harriet, had lived as a free Black person, along with her family, long before slavery was outlawed there. So the popular notion that he was the son or grandson of slaves is a myth. Shortly after his birth, Harriet and several of her children moved north again to the town of Goshen, New York, which is maybe an hour outside of New York City. And that town, like Charlestown and Westchester, was a county seat surrounded by farmland. There, she worked as a domestic, and young Horace explored his early interest in art in various ways by drawing words instead of pictures in school. Words instead of drawing, pictures instead of spelling words in school, winning a newspaper art contest, selling his art at a church fair. As a teenager, he quit school to support his mother, who was not well, and worked in jobs like a hotel porter or a furniture packer that capitalized on his size and strength and stoicism, because they were difficult jobs. This is a photograph of him that was reproduced in an article about him in 1941. I believe it's before he deployed. The date on it is 1917, and the uniform suggests that it's an American uniform completely. I'll explain in a moment, or you may already know the story to which I'm alluding. As Pippin tells it, he was working as an iron molder in New Jersey when the United States entered World War I in 1917. And he enlisted in June, along with several men from his town, Goshen, in what was the 15th Regiment of the New York National Guard, which was organized as a Black unit, but with white officers. It soon became the United States Army's 369th Infantry Regiment when it shipped out for France in December of 1917. And thanks to American racism, the troops who had trained to fight were used as laborers in France until the unit was transferred to French command in spring 1918, and they entered the trenches outfitted in a combination of American uniforms with French helmets, weapons, and supplies. And so you can always see the bandolier belts that they have and the helmets, and then their guns are specifically recognizably French. The regimental history, this book by Arthur Little, called From Harlem to the Rhine, reports that the 369th was under fire for 191 days, which was the longest of any American troops. They never lost a foot of ground or had a man taken prisoner, and they twice recovered men who had been captured. That record earned them a few nicknames. They called themselves the Rattlers, and you can see the rattlesnake insignia on the book's title page. The French called them Men of Bronze, and the Germans supposedly dubbed them Hellfighters, which is the one that stuck. The entire unit was awarded a Croix de Guerre for valor, and there were 2 individual soldiers, and you see them pictured here on the frontispiece, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, who were awarded individual Croix de Guerre for their remarkable service. Pippin held the rank of corporal for most of his deployment. The unit typically spent 20 days of every month under fire, either in the trenches or on nighttime raids in no man's land, and more rarely in major daylight assaults like the one in which he was wounded. That happened in the fall of 1918, when he was shot on the 3rd day of what his memoirs describe as a harrowing multi-day battle. That description, which he does not pin down to a location, largely corresponds to the capture of the French town of Séchault, which was part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive that began the 26th of September, 1918, and decimated his company and his entire regiment. He described the experience at length in a memoir in 1920, and then another statement in 1940. And this is the statement from 1940, which is share with you just a bit of. It was published in the monograph devoted to him that was produced the year after he died. But the text was written while he was alive, I believe, for Sidney Janis's book, They Taught Themselves. So as you can see on the screen, he said, the next morning came like the rest, but the machine gun fire wasn't as heavy. It was the morning as it was the morning before. But the snipers were plentiful. I remember spotting a shell hole and made a run for it. Just as I was in 3 feet and getting ready to dive in, I were hit in the shoulder. There were 4 in the shell hole. One bound my wound the best he could, and they all left me alone. I thought I could crawl out and get to a first aid station, but the sniper kept me in the hole so long that I lost too much blood to get out on my own power. Later that day, a French soldier came by, was about to help him, and was shot by the same sniper, and instead fell on Pippin and trapped him in the hole until he was finally rescued by another French patrol. Pippin spent the rest of the war and 6 months thereafter recovering in hospitals in France and the United States. As he explained, I have 3 wounds, 2 flesh wounds and 1 in the right shoulder and arm, splitting my shoulder blade in 2 places and wrecking the socket of the right arm. When he was discharged on the 22nd of May, 1919, which was long after the rest of his unit, he reported that my right arm was bound to me. I could not use it for anything. And for that reason, he qualified for a 75% disability pension for the rest of his life. This is one of his letters. It's in his own handwriting and has his idiosyncratic spelling. So you should, be aware. The text that I'm going to read starts at the bottom of the first page and continues to the top of the second. As I said, his time in France catalyzed his art making, and that's clear in the oft-quoted reminiscence that is in this letter that says that the war brought out all the art in me. I made some scenes of France, something like 100 of them, yet at last I had to burn them up. But I can never forget suffering, and I will never forget sunset. That is when you could see it. So I came home with all of it in my mind, and I paint from it today. So presumably, Pippin destroyed the 100 scenes of France for reasons of operational security. At this point, it's impossible to know if he devised them as the latest installment in a long-standing but undocumented art-making practice, or as a new development that was prompted by life at the front. And their absence makes it impossible to gauge how they relate to the war imagery that he later deployed, first in illustrated memoir of 1920, and then later in 7 oil paintings that he produced at pivotal stages in his career. So these are examples of the war memoirs that he was producing around 1920. Only one of them is illustrated, and I will show you those illustrations in a moment, but this gives you a sense of this, way he engaged and re-engaged this project over. It sounds like from his memoirs, the winter. So at 62 pages, the illustrated memoir, which you see on the right side, is the most ambitious of 4 notebooks that he made over the winter of 1920 to 21. It follows a straightforward chronology that starts with his departure for France in November 1917 and ends abruptly with his injury in the fall of the following year. And there are 6 full-page drawings in pencil and colored crayon, and they are captioned, that punctuate the text, and I will show you them now. The first one says, "It were near day, a few stars were shining, but we kept on and on." And so I will point out to you that the light gray that you see, in the sky behind them, I read as like a dawn sky or a night sky, as opposed to a specifically daylight scene. This is one of the places that the Germans gave us plenty of gas. Depicts one of the fortifications that he spent quite a bit of time in. This one says the gas were strong and all we could do were to wait, which shows entrenched soldiers in gas masks. And the idea of gas masks is a subject that has only recently been recognized in his paintings. So, but here it's quite clear that he's very aware of the role that they play and the importance of documenting them. This says, as he got over the strip of cedars, he opened up on the German plain, and all at once he were afire and came down to rise no more, which is the only one of these illustrations that relates to the text nearby it. The rest sort of are independent of the narrative that he's producing, but this one is related. And then this one is, the shells were bursting fast as we made the hill. And the last one is, even at night, we could not travel without being seen by the skyline. And so the captions, which I've just shared with you, here I can put them all up so you can see them again, along with occasional apostrophes in the text to a dear reader, suggest that Pippin envisioned, a readership beyond himself, that this was not just a personal project. But whatever his plans, he lost faith in the project relatively quickly and later explained that one winter I tried to write my story of some of my war experiences, but I did such an unsuccessful job, I gave it up. So, in this space, after he gave up on the war diaries, he filled his time in some remarkably, important ways for his daily life. He waited 10 years or so to depict his war experiences again, but in the meanwhile, he married Jenny or a Featherstone Wade Giles, and moved into her house in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So back to the town where he was born. And that is the house that you see on the left. It was a homecoming for him. He had siblings that had stayed in the area, and presumably they may have facilitated his introduction to his wife. Situated in farmland, Westchester was is now a county seat and a college town, and was at the time, with a sizable professional class, an established Black community and business district, a reputation as a summer art colony, and an easy rail and trolley connections to Philadelphia, which was, as I said, about an hour away. The Pippins lived with Jenny Pippin's young son from a previous marriage, on a racially integrated block of tradesmen and laborers that was near the town center. And they were supported by her laundry business and his disability pension and the junk dealing that he did on the side. At first, he channeled his creative impulses into decorating cigar boxes for local competitions, and apparently he did well with those. But he moved on to burn genre scenes, for the most part, into wood panels with a hot poker. And you're seeing that happen in the photograph on the left. On the right. But that work that he's doing there is late. These two examples are examples of what this, initial burst of burnt wood panel making looked like. Both of these were produced, they're not dated ever in his lifetime. So it's like roughly between 1925 and 1930. As he said, in 1930 or so, he traded the hot poker for a paintbrush, and he later explained his thinking that burning these wood panels had, and this is the quote, brought me back to my old self. It was difficult for me to handle a pencil without laying the drawing flat on a table. And this next sentence is particularly significant for our conversation. Then I remembered something I had seen in Vichy, France. I saw a French artist drawing General Pershing with a brush. I tried the same thing and found it was successful with me on canvas. As he continued in the same reminiscence, it becomes clear that the opportunity to depict his time in France was also a key motivation in switching from the wood panel to the paint. He said, I worked slowly on every picture that I did. The first picture that I ever made on canvas was the ending of the war starting home, which is what you see on screen, which took me 3 years to finish. This picture came to me when I thought of the last drive. I sat down and started it in 1930 and finished it in 33. On that picture, I couldn't do what I really wanted to do, but my next pictures, I am working my thought more perfectly. I don't think it's a coincidence that Pippin decided to take up painting on fabric, and that's what it was at this point. He was not yet using artist canvas, to depict his time in France. This is his most complex composition to date, and it required a larger, lighter weight support than a heavy wood panel, and it required a more precise tool than a poker. So he was so deeply invested in this project that he painted and repainted it for 3 years, as he mentioned. And so the surface of it is actually a relief, like it's a sculptural surface on the painting. And the frame is also sculptural because he added to the frame that he built war material that he carved out of wood and in some cases attached metal blades. He made 3 other war paintings around this time. I guess I should explain. It is hard to read, and so I am going to just quickly point out that there are 3 German soldiers forming kind of a triangle in the foreground that are easy to read because their uniforms are light and their faces, I think he actually went back and painted in even lighter with it, like later in life. The black soldiers are much harder to see. There's one here, here's one here, and really it's their blankets that they're wearing across their bodies that make them, visible. There's one here who has thrown his blanket aside, so he's harder to make out. And then there's one here who's lying on the ground, dead, presumably, or at least wounded. There are German soldiers fleeing in the background, and then there are several warplanes in the sky or falling out of the sky. There's this one that's on fire. There's a French one. That's a German one. You can see the crosses. There's a French one here. There's a French one here that is apparently billowing smoke. There's one that's billowing more smoke and on fire here. And then there's the one in the sky. And then obviously they're bursting shells and shell holes, which you'll recall from his own experience as a as I've said, the shell holes bear some resemblance to his own experience, as do the German planes, because he mentions in his account of this that the German planes were after us good and strong. At one point in his story, his own company is reduced to 4 men, and there are 4 men here. But at the same time, he did not stay at the front. He was wounded before Seychelles fell. So he did not see this moment of German surrender firsthand. And the figures that are, making this assault, both the Americans especially, are really standing up, unafraid of the sniper fire that we know was obviously an enormous threat to them from Pippin's own experience. So there are ways in which this painting deals with his experience, but also brings a layer of imagination, or possibly synthesizes other people's experiences of the day as well. So it's not a strict document of his own time, the way that his memoirs are meant to be. The other war paintings that he makes around this time, this one is, he updates a photograph that was made by the United States Signal Corps of French soldiers and Americans at the regimental headquarters. And then he kind of removes the white people from that composition, as well as several of the black soldiers, in the painting that he makes of the subject of this scene. This is also a painting, and it's very hard to see, that he repainted several times, because you can see that in this corner, there was a gray sky. Also down this side, there was gray. And then later, when he had access to brighter colors, he overpainted these details in artist colors. This one is a nighttime scene of which accounts for the sort of tonality. It depicts Sergeant Henry Johnson. It's called, and whom I showed you on the frontispiece of the book that we looked at, who won the Croix de Guerre for defending an outpost against a German assault, virtually single-handed. He and his partner, Needham Roberts, who also got the Croix de Guerre, were deployed to this outpost. Roberts was knocked unconscious, and Henry Johnson held off the Germans for quite a while. And details of the painting correspond to Henry Johnson's recollection of the event. The next one I want to show you is Shell Holes and Observation Balloon, Champagne sector, which is one of the pure landscapes that he paints at this time. He really mostly paints paintings with figures in them, but this one does not have that. And it corresponds to a couple comments that he made in his memoirs of 1920. So it seems like he's actively revisiting those ideas that he described at this point, 10 years before. He said, there were not more than 5 houses in the town that anyone could live in. All the rest were down, even to the stables. And then elsewhere, he says, there were not so many buildings standing now, and what there were, you could see through them. That was the first town I ever seen to be in so much need. The town was shelled in 1916, and there was not a good place for anyone to lay down in that town. And then in his artist statement later, 1937, so after this painting, he said, after I had come from the army, as I was sitting one afternoon, a picture came to me of France. I sat down and made the picture, naming it The Observation Balloon and Shell Hole. The picture was over 4,000 miles from me. As I was frequently around the sector a good many times, it would be impossible for me to have gotten the exact color and nature of that place from anyone else. And this was part of a concern he had at the moment, 1937, to suggest that he was teaching, that his ideas were his own and he was not being taught by anyone else. So these depictions of France form a part of a broad portfolio. These are examples of other parts of that portfolio that he developed in the early and mid-1930s that ranged from black tenant farmers, which is whom you see on the left, and Abraham Lincoln, who is in another slide we'll eventually come to, and to exotic animals, which is what you see on the right. Once he started displaying this work in Westchester businesses in the 1930s, local artists and art mavens quickly took note, and among them were the modernist curator Christian Brinton and the American illustrator N.C. Wyeth, who had recently helped co-found the Chester County Art Association to promote the work of local artists. The group advanced that mission with an annual juried exhibition And Brinton and Wyeth, who comprised two-fifths of the jury, reportedly helped curate Pippin's submission in the 1937 annual. They voted him in for these two paintings that I've shown you on the screen, and then awarded those paintings special mention, which jump-started his career that moved from local in Westchester to regional in Philadelphia to national and international in New York and beyond within 3 years, which is a remarkable accomplishment. Before I leave this slide, I will also just point out the paintings he made. He started the Cabin in the Cotton painting, the one on the left. It was his second painting after the end of the war painting, but has been extensively repainted. The blue and the green, I believe, were additions that and the white, even the crisp, clean white, are all because he repainted them in 1937 or so when he had access to artist paints. The Blue Tiger on the right, he did not repaint. So those, I think, that painting is representative of what his early work looked like before he overpainted some of it as he became more and more of a sort of adept colorist, or frankly, more and more connected to artist materials. So now I want to sort of switch gears a bit and talk about the influence of French aesthetics on his reception. Because, and while I do it, I'm just going to leave this painting on the screen for a bit. It is the kind of work for which he is, in the States at least, best known today, which are genre scenes of Black families, many of which were reportedly inspired by his own memories. This one in particular, he told someone, was a depiction of his mother and himself sleeping together, in Goshen. But that really is a distortion of his project, because he made this kind of work in very narrow sort of bursts, and his actual oeuvre is much broader. But it's a wonderful painting, and as I speak, you can enjoy it. He came to public attention near the end of an international interwar fascination with contemporary self-taught artists who, as I said, were labeled modern primitives or popular painters. And as you will know better than I, the idea had first taken flight in Europe, where it resonated with a primitivist discourse that also included ancient Egyptian carvings, African and oceanic tribal objects, images d'épinal, local folk traditions, children's drawings, a range of material. It landed later in the United States, and with a more limited range of references, especially regarding African tribal objects, because the United States has a real anxiety about people of color. But by the 1930s, the self-taught painter John Kane, whose work you see here in a self-portrait, had become a national celebrity. While autodidacts have little in common beyond generally an indifference to the academic conventions of illusionistic modeling and linear perspective, that did not stop curators, dealers, and collectors from championing their flattened forms and homey subjects as a gateway to modernism for American audiences in particular, who were wary of avant-garde art and politics. As an added benefit, the artist's life stories were often hardscrabble accounts of resilience and determination that resonated with interwar populism. And in the States, also, the enthusiasm for contemporary autodidacts intersected with mounting appreciation for historical United States folk art, which some proponents argued or proposed as kind of a homegrown correlate to European primitivism. Key to this story was the figure of Henri Rousseau. In life, the self-taught French artist may have been regarded as something of an eccentric, but his posthumous influence had ramified so dramatically by the 1920s that he was seen as blue chip, alongside Matisse, Picasso, and Cézanne. That, at least in the United States, which is, I should say, kind of the context that I'm addressing. That dynamic was almost certainly a factor driving those keen to discover his successor, which seems to be a hobby of modernists across the United States in the 20s and the 30s and the early 40s. which would have been the ultimate feather in any modernist's cap. So I'm going to talk about the influence of French aesthetics in sort of four sections. His initial reception in 1937 around this painting, which was in that Chester County show and was a kind of overnight sensation. Rousseau and his contemporaries surfaced variously in Pippin's career, and the earliest and most transparent manifestation was found in his reviews. His success in the 37 show was catnip to local and regional art critics, as indicated by the headline here. The new Negro painter stands out in Chester County exhibition. The review name checks Rousseau and Cézanne in the first paragraph, situating Pippin in a more rarefied conversation about modern art than did the folksy populism that was typical of autodidact's reception. And so the sort of way in which it's characterized here, which I think you can see, but says the annual introduces the work of H. Pippin, Negro artist and primitive, as strikingly individual as the now famous French primitive Douanier Rousseau. It's hoped that Pippin will never discover Cézanne. The decision to triangulate Pippin's position vis-a-vis French modernists, who were probably unfamiliar to the record's readership, may seem like a bold move, but the pattern continues into the 1940s in key reviews in the New York Times, Newsweek, which was a very popular weekly magazine at the time, and the British journal The Studio, to which I shall return. The second avenue would be the Museum of Modern Art, which introduced Pippin to a national audience. Founded in 1929 by well-heeled collectors and the director Alfred Barr, they were all deeply sympathetic to the European avant-garde, and the museum inaugurated its exhibition program with a collection of French modernism, and then included Rousseau at least once a year, usually more, in exhibitions through the mid-1940s. He even turns up in this Cubism and Abstraction show of 1936, and in the family tree on the cover of the catalog, in a campaign that gained steam. More often, his work was part of the museum's sustained campaign to advance self-taught artists as a contemporary movement. And that campaign gained steam over the course of the 1930s with a number of exhibitions. I'll single out just three: Masters of Popular Painting, Modern Primitives of Europe and America in 38, Contemporary Unknown American Painters in 39, and then a Rousseau monographic show in 1942. Pippin made his debut in Masters of Popular Painting, which is a textbook example of the cross currents of French influence that influenced, in his career. The exhibition was an international collaboration, as you may know, with the Grenoble Museum that put American didacts in conversation with their more established European peers. And that project was only possible, as Barr explained in his preface, since, and this is the quote, since the apotheosis of Henri Rousseau created the conditions under which individual popular artists have been taken seriously. So the show was part of a three-part series with Cubism and abstract art, which we just saw the catalog for, and an exhibition called Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism. Both of them were in 36. This one, as I said, was in 38. It was the third and final installment in the series that, as a group, meant, and this is Barr's quote again, to present some of the major divisions or movements of modern art. And I assume that he was just too cagey to say in print that the shows as a set, the three of them, were a crash course in European modernism for isolationist Americans at a time when rising fascism overseas was putting those values under pressure. MoMA organized the first two installments on its own, but collaborated on this third one in a division of labor that telegraphs France's deep history in the field. The Grenoble Museum basically recycled an exhibition that it had already traveled in 1937, and then MoMA had to, produce its checklist from scratch. And then MoMA hosted the show in New York and sent it on a national tour, there were no European venues for the exhibition. Both the European and the American catalog essays describe these autodidacts as artists of the people, in a nod to class consciousness that, fit with anti-fascist aesthetics in the West and, Europe and America. And then a few years later, Barr made the connection explicit when he said, the modern primitives, though each developed in personal isolation, seem international in character even more than their professionally trained colleagues. It's hard to tell a French primitive from an American. All share the common denominator of Western culture at its most democratic level, and all express the straightforward, innocent, and convincing vision of the common man, ignorant of art or unaffected by it. So Pippin was the only Black artist in the show. And he was a late addition, having come to the Museum of Modern Art's attention in September 37 through Christian Brinton, whom we've heard of from the Chester County Art Association. Brinton sent 11 paintings. MoMA chose these 4, 2 that had been in the Chester County Art Association show already, the Cabin in the Cotton and the Blue Tiger, and then 2 that depicted his war experience, End of the War Starting Home and Shell Holes and Observation Balloon. And you can see them installed in the museum here. They start, that's Cabin in the Cotton, and they run this way. When the show went on tour, MoMA only sent the war paintings out, which is another example of how that time in France winds up kind of propelling his career at pivotal moments. The third influence that I'd like to speak about is the collector Albert Barnes, whom Pippin met in 1940. So this is an installation shot from his foundation, which is where the vast majority of the work that he acquired was installed. And it was installed in these salon-style installations that he arranged on sort of formalist terms. His foundation at the time was located just across the Philadelphia line in Marion. Now it's been unfortunately relocated. He made his fortune in pharmaceuticals and had been collecting art since 1912 as an early adopter across several fields, historical United States and folk art and decorative arts. You see some of that in the shot. Native American pottery and jewelry, African tribal objects, and then, of course, most famously, modern European and American art, including, and I'm just going to mention this, you probably know, but if you don't, it's kind of staggering, the numbers. 180 paintings and drawings by Renoir, 67 by Cézanne, 59 by Matisse, 45 by Picasso, 16 by Modigliani, 18 by Rousseau, etc., and 4 by John Kane. And here I chose this particular shot because the landscapes that you see above the andirons, one is a Kane and one is a Rousseau. So this is the way that Barnes would organize his installations, that these works by artists that, have something in common to the eye, not necessarily biographically or nationally or any other way, are in conversation on these walls. For just some context, Barnes bought the Rousseaus, which is apparently the largest collection of his work in the world, between 1923 and 29, and paid 45,000 francs plus a commission for the first one, which was then the going rate for like a prime Matisse or Picasso. So Barnes was really all in on Rousseau. And he used this collection and his foundation as an art education institution to teach people how to see art. He held classes and that were private, and I'll show you one of those in a minute. And so if you know anything about the foundation these days, they present themselves as a museum, but that is exactly the opposite of what he thought he was doing. It's really a betrayal of his whole project, but that's a conversation for another day. This is Barnes with Pippin, and Pippin's painting is between them. In many ways, they were well suited to each other. When they met in 1940, the 52-year-old artist had been showing, selling to, and circulating with elite collectors for years in Westchester, so he was well aware of his appeal for modern art aficionados like Barnes. And Barnes, who had spent decades cultivating his celebrity status as a prescient connoisseur of European modernism and African and Black American cultural production, was always on the lookout for opportunities to burnish that reputation. The pair met in 1940 in Philadelphia at Pippin's first gallery show, where the 22 oils that were on view represented almost the entire body of work that Pippin had made in that medium. Most were figure paintings, as I mentioned, including 6 that related directly or indirectly to his war experience in France. And another example of the way that work had a foundational role in his success. Before the show even opened, Barnes bought Abraham Lincoln and his father painting a cabin on Pigeon Creek for himself, and Cabin in the Cotton, which we've looked at a few times, for a friend, encouraged his colleague, Violette de Mazia, to buy another painting, and then volunteered to write the catalog essay. In return, there we have it. That is the painting on the left that Barnes bought for his own collection. And the painting on the right is the Cabin in the Cotton that we've seen several times now that he bought for the movie star Charles Laughton. And then Barnes used both of these purchases to generate publicity for Pippin's show, which made him kind of a national celebrity because of the interest of Barnes, who was a national celebrity at the time, and also Laughton, the movie star. In return, Pippin started attending weekly art appreciation at the classes at the foundation in the spring of 1940, despite his previous very public contention that, quote, "it seems impossible for another to teach one of art." He began in January, just after Barnes bought that first painting, and then attended through May and never went back. But Barnes and Pippin's relationship was taking off very quickly. What you see on the left is a photo that was made of Pippin at the Barnes Foundation by the photographer Carl Van Vechten, who was instrumental in depicting a lot of important African American cultural figures. That's a medieval fountain that Barnes had on his grounds. And then the other photo is just giving you a sense of how Barnes conducted these classes when he was teaching them. It's in 42, so that's just shortly after Pippin had attended. So from there, Barnes and Pippin's reputation developed quickly, with Barnes hosting the artist at various foundation events, buying more work, writing another essay, and helping to arrange solo shows and commissions. Thanks in part to Barnes's efforts, as that I've already described, the Philadelphia show sold out quickly, which left Pippin with a new problem. The way things look now, it will be a sellout, and I won't have any pictures to bring back after the show's over. I've got to get busy and get enough pictures together for another show, maybe in New York, and I believe the people there will like them too, same as they do in Philadelphia. And by June, he was telling a friend that this success that he'd enjoyed will make it, and this is a quote, will make it harder for him because he must produce better and better pictures. And the way he solves this problem, I would argue, is by adopting a number of influences from French modernism that he acquired from his time at the foundation. This is just a good example of where that comes in. He picks up the really hot colors and hot color combinations that Matisse and Rousseau would have used, and then recycles them in his own work. Christ and the Women of Samaria is now in the collection of the Barnes Foundation. Amish Letter Writer is in a private collection. But Barnes talks about both of them when he writes that catalog essay for Pippin's next show. He says, and this is Barnes talking, the present exhibition, this 1941 solo show in Philadelphia, makes the beholder wonder what has happened to Pippin during the past year that would explain the difference between his work of today and that of the recent past. And the answer to that is Pippin spent a spring at the Barnes Foundation, but Barnes leaves that unsaid. He continues, Pippin has moved from his earlier limited world into a richer environment filled with the ideas and feelings of great painters of the past and the present. Here, as in Matisse, colors thus used are expressive as well as decorative, each in a personal, individual manner. In Pippin's Amish letter writer, which you see on the right, for example, the sensuous qualities of the colors in the moon, tablecloth, lampshade, and cup are as personal to Pippin as Matisse's are to Matisse. In Women of Samaria, a Venetian theme, the drama of the scene is intensified by the exotic and daring color contrasts. The second clue to Barnes's influence is that Pippin developed a kind of a brand new interest in flowers and still life, which he produced in two bursts, one associated with his time at the foundation from like 40 to 42, and then he returns to this late in life. I don't think we'll have time to talk about them, but we can talk about this. The timing is impossible to ignore, really. Given prior to his time at the foundation in spring 1940, his only floral subject was called The Admirer. It's from 1938, and it's been lost since the 60s. But it reportedly depicted, and this is a quote, an infant sitting amid a bed of flowers on a lawn against a background of hedge and sky. Then, all of a sudden, after a few months at the Barnes Foundation, Pippin starts making 5 paintings that are florals or still lifes that he shows at his fall show at the Big New Gallery. And then 3 more, in addition to those, that he shows in the spring at the Carlin Gallery. And so in New York, he shows 5 new paintings in this vein. And then in Philadelphia, he shows 3 more. That's a total of 8, plus some that, he may have sold and did not show. The New York show was widely and well reviewed. And in the New Yorker magazine, which was Robert M. Coates observed, and this is a quote, the works have a decided charm and reveal too a natural sophistication in the use of color that is at times surprising. I particularly like the flower pieces, such as My Backyard, Roses in a Jar, and the really glowing Roses with Red Chair. And that's what you're looking at on the screen, Roses with Red Chair. I apologize for the quality of the slide. That painting is in private hands, and I've never been able to get a good photo of it. Others shared the same view. Or a similar view. In the first instance of international attention for Pippin, Brian Holm, writing for the British journal The Studio, which his family had published for generations, reproduced a full-page illustration of that painting, the one on the left, to accompany his review of what he described as the extremely interesting exhibition that recalls at once the work of Rousseau. There is even a tinge of Matisse about this painting, and many of his other paintings too. He continues, in this case erroneously, that, quote, unless you cry copy, it is at once interesting and significant to note that Pippin, as far as can be made out, has had no contact with the work of other painters, let alone with so specialized a group as the French moderns. Art News' critic singled out the same work as perhaps the most sophisticated painting shown for its, and this is the quote, very factual representation of objects silhouetted against a vivid blue and further enriched by the intricacies of pattern of an oriental rug. Of course, the combination of the enormous top-heavy bouquet and the tiny chair is closer to fantasy than fact, which may be what the writer meant by sophisticated. And it's tempting to think that Pippin took up the new subject in part to appeal to Barnes, or maybe completely, who was his most avid collector at the time. He'd done something similar in his interest in African American subjects, which had not been a giant component of Pippin's work until the 1940s, when the painting that you see on the right of a Black family in a cabin follows Barnes's interest in buying cabin paintings, right? Barnes had just bought the cabin painting with Abraham Lincoln and the cabin in the cotton painting with Black family. And then all of a sudden, Pippin starts painting Black families and cabins. And luckily for him, Barnes bought that painting too. And then he continues when Barnes buys these paintings of Black families. Pippin's even more motivated to paint more Black subjects in domestic interiors. But regardless of Pippin's expectations that Barnes might be excited about the florals, especially given Barnes's enormous enthusiasm for them in his own collection, he completely ignored that development. He didn't take credit for it in any writing, and he did not buy any of the paintings. But they quickly found homes. The Roses with Red Chair sold before the show even opened, and Roses in a Jar was the only official sale of the show. And interestingly, it went to the critic and sculptor Rosamund Frost, who had grown up in Europe with an artist mother. So she was exquisitely sensitive to the modernist influences and recognized them in Pippin's work, and then wrote a glowing feature about him years later in Art News that reinforced his connection to Rousseau and his preferences for Renoir's color. So I feel like I'm not sure if I have time to talk about the surrealist influence in his work, more than to say that is the fourth category. And when the surrealists came to New York in the 40s, surrealists being Breton and Duchamp, who was already here, they mounted, the first Papers of Surrealism exhibition to raise money for French defense, and they were quite taken with the idea of self-taught artists as surrealists avant la lettre. They were particularly fond of the artist Maurice Hirschfeld, whose painting you see them posing with on the left. And they included his work in the first Papers of Surrealism show. But by the 45, Pippin was also on their radar because Duchamp served on a jury with Sidney Janis, who was instrumental in the sort of as a hinge between the expat French surrealists and the American autodidacts and Museum of Modern Art crowd, organized an art contest for a movie called I always forget Bel Ami, but that's not the Private Affairs of Bel Ami, which is based on a novel by Guy de Maupassant, which describes a painting of the Temptation of St. Anthony. So they organized this contest, Hollywood contest. They invited every prominent surrealist they could find and Pippin to participate. This is the painting that he made for that project, which again, the painting is one thing. It did not win the contest, but the marketing for the contest put him constantly in conversation with the leading surrealist and magical realists of the day. So that also creates this additional layer of context in which his work is understood in terms of French aesthetics. I want to allow time for questions, so I'm going to wrap up by saying that I was hoping to reframe Pippin's story today to focus on this under-examined dimension of his dialogue with contemporary French art, to shed light on how modernist aesthetics, and particularly how the sort of modernist aesthetics vis-a-vis self-taught artists, at least in his case, percolated into spaces seemingly impervious to that rhetoric, or at least reportedly impervious to that rhetoric. And then in so doing, open a richer sense of the period and its players. And I'm happy to talk more about any of this. And I thank you for your attention.